Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
For more than 15 years, one of the darkest mysteries on Long Island has remained without an answer. In 2011, investigators searching the area around Gilgo Beach discovered the remains of an unidentified person along Ocean Parkway. The victim was young, of Asian ancestry, and had suffered a violent death. But there was one problem: nobody knew who they were. They became known simply as Asian Doe. For years, investigators tried to uncover their identity. Facial reconstructions were released. DNA analysis was performed. Genetic genealogy was explored. But every attempt ended the same way: no name. And the mystery became even more complicated because the remains were discovered in the same area where the bodies of several women were found during the investigation that eventually led to serial killer Rex Heuermann. But authorities have never established that Asian Doe was one of Heuermann's victims. In 2026, the case suddenly received new attention. After Heuermann pleaded guilty to killing 8 women, investigators renewed their efforts to identify the person whose remains were still waiting for a name. And now, they're going directly into New York's Chinatown, asking members of the community to voluntarily provide DNA samples that could finally reveal where Asian Doe came from. After 15 years, the question remains the same: who is Asian Doe? And perhaps most importantly, who killed them? This is a mystery of Gilgo Beach's Asian Doe. The story of Asian Doe begins in one of the most haunting locations on Long Island. Gilgo Beach, on the southern shore of New York, is known for its beaches, vacation homes, and long stretches of quiet coastline. But in December 2010, the area became the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in modern American history. On December 11th, 2010, a police officer conducting a training exercise with a police dog along Ocean Parkway discovered human remains near Gilgo Beach. The discovery was not initially expected to lead to one of the largest murder investigations in New York history. But as detectives searched the surrounding area, they began finding more. Within days, several sets of human remains have been discovered along the same stretch of road. The victims were eventually identified as women who had disappeared from the New York area, and investigators began to suspect that at least some of the deaths could be connected. Then, months later, investigators made another discovery. On April 4th, 2011, skeletal remains were found along Ocean Parkway, near Gilgo Beach. Unlike several of the other victims, investigators could not determine the person's identity. The remains belonged to a biological male of Asian descent, and the individual became known simply as Asian Doe. There was no driver's license, no passport, no family member waiting for answers, no confirmed missing persons report that could immediately provide a name. The remains were all that investigators had, and that created a unique problem. A murder investigation normally begins with a victim's identity. Detectives can examine their relationships, their workplace, their friends, their family, and the people they were last seen with. But with Asian Doe, investigators didn't even know who they were looking for. They had a body, but no name. And as the years passed, that unidentified victim became connected to one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries. The Gilgo Beach investigation would eventually lead police to a suspect accused of multiple murders. But even as investigators made progress in identifying other victims, one person remained a mystery: Asian Doe. And for more than 15 years, the question remained the same: who was this person? When investigators examined the remains, they were able to learn a surprising amount about the person who had been left along Ocean Parkway. But knowing someone's physical characteristics is very different from knowing who they actually were. The remains belonged to a biological male of Asian descent, with investigators later estimating that the person was likely from southern China and was between approximately 17 and 23 years old when they died. Their height was estimated at roughly 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 9 inches. There was another detail that immediately made the case more unusual. The person had been wearing women's clothing, including a blue ribbed shirt, another shirt, blast pants, and a bra. Investigators emphasized that these details could potentially help someone recognize the victim, but they also cautioned against assuming how the person identified themselves simply from the clothing they were wearing. The cause of death was also disturbing. Investigators determined that Asian Doe had died from blunt force trauma. Their death had occurred during or before 2006, meaning the remains had been lying near Ocean Parkway for at least 5 years before they were discovered in 2011. But despite all of this information, there was still no name. No missing person report that investigators could confidently connect to the remains. No family member who recognized the description. No friend who suddenly realized that someone they knew had disappeared years earlier. And that created an enormous problem for investigators. They didn't simply need to solve a murder. They first had to discover who the victim was. A forensic artist created reconstructions showing what Asian Doe may have looked like before their death. Investigators released information about the clothing and physical characteristics, hoping that someone would recognize the person. The appeal was eventually translated into several languages, including Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, Thai, Korean, and Indonesian, in an attempt to reach communities that might have information about the victim. The authorities knew that somewhere there had to be people who remembered this person. Someone had gone to school with them. Someone had worked with them. Someone had been their friend. Someone had known their family. And yet, for years, nobody could put a name to the remains. Then came another problem. The discovery of Asian Doe had occurred in the middle of a much larger investigation. The bodies found around Gilgo Beach had already led investigators to one of the most notorious murder cases in New York. And eventually, the name Rex Heuermann would become impossible to ignore. But one important question remained. Was Asian Doe connected to him? And if so, why had this victim never been identified? For years, the discovery of Asian Doe remained just one piece of a much larger mystery. The bodies found along Gilgo Beach had already raised the possibility that a serial killer was operating on Long Island, but investigators struggled to determine whether all of the victims were connected. Then, in 2023, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Police arrested Rex Heuermann, an architect who lived in Massapequa Park, Long Island. Investigators accused him of killing multiple women whose remains had been discovered in connection with the Gilgo Beach investigation. Over the following years, prosecutors charged him in 7 murders. In April 2026, Heuermann pleaded guilty to those 7 killings and also admitted to killing an 8th victim, Karen Vergata. He was subsequently sentenced to multiple life sentences. For the families of those women, it was a moment they had waited years to see. But for investigators studying Asian Doe, the story was far from over. Asian Doe had been discovered in the same general area as several of Heuermann's victims. The victim had also been killed by blunt force trauma, and their remains had been hidden along Ocean Parkway years before they were found. That naturally raised an obvious question. Could Asian Doe have been another victim of Rex Heuermann? The answer is that investigators have not established that connection. Heuermann has not been charged with Asian Doe's murder, and authorities have not publicly concluded that he was responsible for the death. But there were details that investigators considered significant. Authorities have revealed that Heuermann's internet search history included searches involving Asian men, including the phrase Asian twinks. That information has attracted considerable attention because of Asian Doe's background and the fact that the victim was found wearing women's clothing. Still, a search history alone does not establish that Heuermann killed this particular victim. And this distinction is important. A connection can be suspicious without being proven. For investigators, the most important question remained the same as it had been since 2011. Who was Asian Doe? Because until they knew the victim's identity, it was difficult to reconstruct their life determine where they had come from, or establish exactly how they ended up on Long Island. And that meant the case required something that had already transformed countless cold cases across the United States: DNA. But this time, the challenge wasn't simply finding a DNA match. It was finding the right people to compare it with. For more than 15 years, investigators had tried to answer one seemingly simple question: who was Asian Doe? Traditional DNA testing confirmed that the victim had Asian ancestry, but that information alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed a person, or a relative, whose DNA could connect the remains to an actual family. That is where investigative genetic genealogy came in. The technique has transformed cold case investigations across the United States. Instead of searching for an exact DNA match, investigators can look for genetic relatives and then work backward through family trees, sometimes using distant connections to identify an unknown victim. But in Asian Doe's case, there was a major obstacle. There simply weren't enough people of relevant Asian ancestry represented in the commercial genetic databases investigators could use. That meant the usual genealogical approach had far fewer potential matches to work with. Investigators tried facial reconstructions and other forensic techniques, but none produced the breakthrough they were looking for. Then, in 2026, investigators decided to try something different. Instead of waiting for the right DNA profile to appear in a database, they went looking for people themselves. In August, Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney and members of the Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force traveled to New York City's Chinatown as part of a public campaign asking members of the Chinese community to voluntarily provide DNA samples. The goal was simple: find genetic connections that could finally lead investigators to Asian Doe's family. At the event, approximately 23 people provided samples. According to the district attorney, the samples were being sent to a private laboratory and would be used specifically for identification purposes rather than being entered into law enforcement databases. It was an unusual approach to an old problem. For years, investigators have been waiting for technology to reveal the victim's identity. Now, they were trying to expand the pool of DNA that technology could search. And suddenly, after 15 years of silence, there was a new possibility. Maybe Asian Doe wasn't destined to remain unidentified forever. Maybe somewhere in New York, or somewhere else in the world, there was a person carrying a piece of the same genetic story. A distant cousin, a relative, a family that had been waiting for answers without even knowing exactly what they were waiting for. But even if investigators managed to identify Asian Doe, one enormous question will remain: who killed them? For 15 years, investigators searched for a way to give Asian Doe their name back. Traditional forensic methods had failed, facial reconstructions produced no breakthrough, and the available DNA databases simply didn't contain enough potential relatives who could help identify the victim. Then, in August 2026, investigators took an unusual step. Instead of waiting for a genetic match to appear online, Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney and members of the Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force traveled to Manhattan's Chinatown and began asking members of the Chinese community for voluntary DNA samples. The goal was to find distant genetic relatives who could help investigators build a family tree leading back to Asian Doe. The timing was significant. The search came only months after Rex Heuermann pleaded guilty to killing 8 women connected to the Gilgo Beach investigation. His conviction brought answers to several families, but Asian Doe remained unidentified. And importantly, Heuermann has not been charged with Asian Doe's murder. Investigators have never publicly established that he was responsible for this particular death. At the Chinatown event, approximately 23 people provided DNA samples. Authorities said the samples would be sent to a private laboratory and used specifically to help identify Asian Doe rather than being entered into law enforcement databases. It was a remarkably simple idea. Find someone who shares enough DNA with the unidentified victim, then follow the connections. A cousin, a distant relative, a family branch that investigators never knew existed. And from there, potentially reconstruct an entire family tree. But there was still no guarantee it would work. The victim may have had relatives who never submitted their DNA to any database. Their family may have lived outside the United States. Records may have been incomplete, and even a genetic connection might take months of research to turn into a confirmed identity. Still, for the first time in years, investigators had a new strategy. And this time, they weren't simply searching through old records. They were asking an entire community to help. Because somewhere, there may be a family that has spent more than 15 years wondering what happened to someone they loved. A family that may not even know that their missing relative was found. A person who has been waiting all this time, without knowing where they went. And if the DNA finally reveals that connection, Asian Doe could finally become a real name. But identifying the victim would only solve half of the mystery. The other half will be finding out who put them on that beach. For 15 years, Asian Doe has existed without a confirmed identity. Investigators know how this person died, roughly when they died, and where their remains are discovered. They have forensic information, DNA, facial reconstructions, and clues about their ancestry. But none of those things can answer the most important question. What was their name? That is why the latest DNA campaign could be so important. The samples collected in Manhattan's Chinatown are not expected to provide an instant answer. Instead, investigators are looking for genetic connections that could lead to relatives of the unidentified victim. Even a distant connection could potentially give genealogists a starting point for reconstructing a family tree and eventually identifying Asian Doe. But there's another reason this investigation matters. Identifying Asian Doe wouldn't simply put a name on a case file. It could reveal an entire life that has remained hidden for more than a decade. Where they were born, where they grew up, who their friends were, who their family was, and perhaps most importantly, when and why they disappeared. It could also answer questions investigators have been unable to ask for 15 years. Did Asian Doe have connections to New York? Were they reported missing under another name? Did someone know they were in danger? And was their death connected to the other killings around Gilgo Beach? Or was it something entirely separate? That last question may be the most important of all, because Asian Doe was found close to the remains of several women whose murders were eventually linked to Rex Heuermann. But despite the proximity, investigators have not charged Heuermann with Asian Doe's murder, and there is currently no definitive public evidence establishing that he was responsible. The possibility remains, but possibility is not proof. And until Asian Doe is identified, investigators are missing one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. A name. A name could lead to a family. A family could lead to a history. And that history could finally reveal what happened before Asian Doe ended up on Gilgo Beach. For now, investigators are waiting for the DNA results. And somewhere in the world, there may be a family that has been waiting for answers for 15 years without even knowing where to look. Maybe they're about to get them. For more than 15 years, this case has had almost everything investigators need to tell part of the story. They know where the remains were found. They know roughly when the victim died. They know the person was young, of Asian descent, and died from blunt force trauma. They even have DNA. But they still don't have the one thing that could change everything. A name. In August 2026, investigators took their search directly to Manhattan's Chinatown, collecting voluntary DNA samples from members of the Chinese community in the hope of finding a genetic connection to Asian Doe. Around 23 people provided samples during the initial effort, and authorities say the samples are being analyzed by a private laboratory specifically for identification purposes. It may take time before those samples produce anything. They may reveal a distant relative. They may lead investigators down a completely unexpected family tree. Or they may produce no match at all. But the attempt itself represents something important. The investigation hasn't been abandoned. More than 15 years after Asian Doe was discovered, Detectives are still searching for the person behind the remains. And if they eventually find that name, the entire investigation could change. A family could finally learn what happened to someone they may have been searching for without knowing where to look. Investigators could reconstruct the victims' final years. They could discover where they lived, who they knew, when they disappeared, and perhaps why they ended up on Gilgo Beach. But one question will remain even after the identity is known. Who killed them? Rex Hoyerman has admitted to killing 8 women in the Gilgo Beach investigation, but authorities have not charged him with Asian Doe's murder and have not publicly established that he was responsible for this death. So for now, there's still 2 mysteries. Who was Asian Doe? And who took their life? Maybe the DNA collected in Chinatown will finally answer the first. And perhaps, once a name is discovered, the second mystery will finally have somewhere to begin. Because after 15 years, Asian Doe deserves more than a forensic label. They deserve their name back. And until that happens, the mystery of Gilgo Beach's Asian Doe remains unsolved.